Welcome to another Magical Egypt Dialogue. My name is Chance Gardner, and I'm the writer and producer of the Magical Egypt series. In this special conversation, we'll be discussing the role of art and artist, and how it's shifted through the ages. In particular, we'll be discussing a centrally important discovery that we've made in the course of a 5-year aesthetic research project. And what it says about the unexpected role that art and aesthetics played in the ancient world. But also what a study of ancient aesthetics has revealed about both the level of intelligence of our most distant ancestors and the totally unexpected degree of scientific sophistication that our earliest art testifies to. These discoveries are certain to be very controversial because they demand a radical rethinking of our picture of human development. I'll be joined by my friend and important contributor to the research team, Brad Clausen. Brad's a very high-profile illustrator known for his iconic rock and roll poster work for some of the biggest bands in the world. And hereafter, as one of the discoverers of a truly groundbreaking revelation about a secret hidden in ancient art, statuary, and architecture. All right, folks, it seems we find ourselves in the company of the remarkable Brad Clausen today, heir to the Clausen pickle fortune. Are you related to the Clausen pickles?
I get asked that all the time, and I wish that I was, because then I would probably have some sort of crazy trust fund and never have to work ever again. So
get in on that sweet, sweet pickle money.
Yeah.
All right. So we've just started releasing some excerpts from the show. We are getting some remarkable feedback. The discoveries that you made and the biometric discoveries that we've made in the art and the science that's coming through this aesthetic study, remarkable and profound and history-changing, and obviously one of the most one of the most radical and history-changing discoveries was your discovery of the Venus of Willendorf and the old Ishtar and Inanna statues. So I've been bracing myself for the inevitable attack. You know, whenever you introduce something that's so confrontational, you can expect a little pushback, but overwhelmingly we've been getting fantastic responses from people. So one of the things I wanted to talk about, there's recently a couple of really interesting developments that had to do with the Venus of Willendorf. Facebook recently censored the Venus of Willendorf and caused such an uproar, and a number of universities and museums went online and just beat them until they retracted their censorship and apologized for, I mean, I can see why that would drive the men wild, you know? This has been driving men wild for 40,000 years.
You know, what I like about that little sub-headline in there is that it's described as dangerously pornographic.
It's dangerously pornographic.
Not just pornographic, dangerously. What does that even imply? How do you? There's levels of pornography that are safe, and there's others that are dangerous.
There's a reason why some strip clubs will only let you be topless and not topless and bottomless, because at a certain point, I guess the basal ganglia take over, and you become an uncontrollable rapist if you see too much.
That could be maybe dangerous pornography.
So yeah, I don't know what to say about that, except that it put me in mind of these discoveries, and it very nicely dovetails with the release of Magical Egypt Series 2, and really the backbone of the new show is this aesthetic research project that each of us have come to, each of us came to in our own way, but then you and I and Gary at the start of this thing really sort of synergized because we were all researching kind of the same phenomenon. Each of us were coming at it from a different direction. Interestingly, each of us were coming at it from a different view. There's the coronal view of the brain, the axial view, and the sagittal view. That was a strange bit of trivia that we each came at it. We all come to this brain from the different views. But your discoveries, what I found really interesting that really brought me into it was your discovery of the ram sphinxes at Karnak that corresponded to the brainstem. And from there, you kept digging, and it led you to the Ishtar and Inanna statues. And then from there, all the way back to literally the very oldest works of art that we know about, that are the Venus of Willendorf.
So at some point, as I was looking up different images of brain anatomy, I came across this image of this plastic model of a brainstem. And I started to notice that the top half of it, which is the thalamus and the ventricles that are sitting on top of the brainstem, this top part up in here, being the thalamus, I started to realize that it looked like the kind of a cartoon snout of an animal, like the way that you would draw a dog's snout or a rabbit's snout or a sheep or a ram's snout. And I started to realize that I'd seen this shape before. I'd seen this composition of a ram's nose sitting on top of a column. And I quickly realized that what I was looking at was the ram sphinxes of Karnak, the statues on the Avenue of Sphinxes at Karnak. And when I put them side by side, it seemed to be almost a pretty obvious match to me that what I was looking at was a representation of a brainstem in the ram sphinx of Karnak. And the more I started looking at this image and the more I started to see this plastic model in relationship to these ram sphinxes, I started to see an even sort of bigger correspondence of shapes and relationships. And I started to notice that when you look at other renderings of brainstems, you could get this sort of generic composition where you have this tubular leg shape, you have a torso, you have a face, and you have sort of a hat. The same sort of thing I was noticing in these ram sphinxes, that we were seeing a very similar compositional arrangement of shapes. Now in the plastic model over here, when you're looking at the infundibulum and the mammillary bodies, it's kind of smushed. This is kind of a compressed looking thing, so you can't really see the face there very much. But when you look at other illustrations of brainstems, you start to see more this kind of humanoid figure. You start to see a leg form, a torso, and then you start to see a face in between this piece of the brain, which is the cerebral crust. These two round shapes, which kind of look like eyes, are the mammillary bodies. And this piece right here is the infundibulum. Based off of this correspondence, the infundibulum is sitting exactly in the same place that the uraeus is on the Egyptian headdress. Now, when we look at other examples of brainstems in relationship to this ram sphinx statue, you have this kind of cartoonish looking simple version of a face. And even the way that the cerebral crust kind of bends outward, the statue of Osiris, his face and his headdress both kind of follow that same sort of arc. And the more I started looking at this, the more I started to realize that this is exactly the same as in Gerard David's painting of the Transfiguration of Christ, that there is a figure that is representing the brainstem, that's holding up the brainstem. And you have this ram-headed shape of the brain when you're looking at a coronal cross-section of the brain. It has sort of a ram-like look to it. You kind of have these horns on the side that are similar to the horns of the ram. But the thing that really clued me in, as I was mentioning before, was the ventricles. The ventricles of the brain make this kind of snout, this kind of three-pointed cartoon version of a snout. And in some images, if it's an X-ray, like in this one, or an MRI scan, you'll see the ventricles as very large and expanded. But in other images where the brain has been taken out of the skull, the ventricles have contracted and they're smaller. So it was becoming more and more clear to me as I was looking at this stuff that the Ram Sphinx was a brainstem. It was not only showing a brainstem, but it was showing a brain sitting on top of it.
It not only changes the context of what we can believe about the intelligence and the degree of science in our ancient past, but also the thing that I really quite like about this is it speaks to how the purpose of art seems to have changed. That in the age before books and printing, art was didactic and art was a teaching tool.
Yeah, I think, and I think to me from an artist standpoint, I mean, you and I have talked about this, but that's always been one of my, when you talk about the idea of a masterpiece, of the Freemasonic idea of a masterpiece, and I know when I'm making my own art, if I can not only make something that's visually pleasing, but I can tie in symbology and tie into this information, and I can tell a story in a single. The posters are just one image, right? I only get one panel of a comic book basically to tell a story, and I think some of the most masterful pieces of art are those ones that tie in these questions and bigger questions, these bigger ideas and these concepts, rather than just being like, that's a really cool, sculpture of a human being, or that's a really cool, painting of this, that, the other thing. The thing I always think of the perfect example of that is this Tool song Lateralis, which speaks about the Fibonacci sequence. It talks about the spiraling aspect. It talks so much about these bigger esoteric subjects, and then it becomes that where the message of the medium is the message, and there's this blending of it's all speaking. Everything that you're creating and everything that you're doing is all speaking to these bigger things, and you're doing it through song or through art or through something like that. And clearly, as human beings, we respond to art. We make art. I mean, that's one of the things I find probably the most interesting about human beings is that we make art. I mean, the other animals don't seem to do that as far as I can see. If there's no other creatures out there expressing themselves that way. And so when you see artists expressing these complex, bigger issues sort of about, the mysteries, I find that stuff to be sort of the true mark of a masterpiece, where it's communicating ideas more so than just communicating pleasing aesthetic qualities. And like you said, it would be didactic, or even in the same way that you could think of like stained glass windows, that if you went into a church and the lights beaming through those colorful glass windows, that would basically be like television in a sense, or a backlit image that you can help express the ideas that you're trying to express. So I don't think it's not surprising that as human beings that we're curious and we want to know, why are we here? What's the meaning of all this? That our ancestors were doing the same thing. They were curious. They wanted to know. And it appears that they figured a lot out, and then they conveyed it in this brilliant artwork, which goes to that idea that the sort of John West 101, the idea that this is from primitive people or simple people is just absurd. I mean, to me, that just means you've never made a piece of artwork if you think this is primitive. I mean, primitive artwork is on refrigerators all across the globe from little kids. That's primitive. When they don't know how to make shapes, they don't know how to, they don't know how to correlate what's happening in their brain to get their hand to do that stuff. And you could say little kids make, oh no, they're untainted and they're making this pure artwork, maybe, but it's primitive. They don't know what they're doing. And you look at the artwork of Egypt and you go back and back, and it's I don't see primitive minds when I see that stuff. I don't see simple human beings. I see very complex minds that are creating these things and encoding symbolism and complex concepts into very simple, or not very simple, but into singular images, or even but the temple in itself is just, any of these temples are just obviously not a single image. Those things are just absolutely mind-blowing. But
there was an author, James Wasserman, who did a really good interpretation of the Book of the Dead. Wasserman wrote this fantastic guide to the occult, the visual iconography of the occult traditions. And the way that he started the book was that man is the shadow of God, and God's propensity for creation is reflected in man in our desire to create. And we create, obviously, in a lower dimensional form, but our impulse, like you said, our impulse to create imagery is, theosophically, this hologram of the divine impulse. The other thing you were mentioning was, well, first of all, when you talk about primitive art, the more I study this and the more time I spend with this, my idea of primitive art is a velvet Elvis or a poster of dogs playing poker, you know? That's primitive art.
Did you ever have one of those synchronicities where you learn a new word and then almost immediately someone around you says that word? This is one of those times. Here are some terms that are going to become important for you in the immediate near future. Didactic. Didactic means to teach. Didactic art is designed to teach or transmit something. Didactic architecture and didactic statuary is the same thing. Why is this important? You'll see.
Sophisticated art is art that serves a function. Art that is didactic, like we said. Didactic means to teach. That before there were books, you walked through a book. A temple was a book, and the statuary was a book. And my own experience with my whole life, my whole professional life, was that I got these 10-second snippets in between Seinfeld and The Simpsons. I had 10 seconds to use some sound, color, typography, and maybe a clip, usually not any, very little narration. And I had to create a mood, and I had to create excitement, and I had to reach into the psyche and create a response. Usually, you only have time for involuntary responses. So we've talked a lot about the Vedantic color theory and how you can really manipulate a person against their will, or especially with their will if they're into it, through the use of color and sound and things like that. And so art, to me, that is primitive, is art that really serves no function except to cover a space on your wall. But the sophisticated use of art, no matter what the actual techniques of art are, the sophisticated use of art is to convey some idea. So promos on television are barely less primitive than a Velvet Elvis painting. But when you look at sacred art and didactic art, that really was the highest purpose to which art was used. And I've been thinking about, in particular, you walk into Luxor or Karnak, and you walk through those rows of sphinxes, the Sphinx colonnade, the ram-headed sphinxes. And when you consider that the reason you were going into the temple was to participate in the mystery traditions, hopefully as an initiate, but even as just the rabble would be led into the outer courtyard on occasion. And because you were going into the temple to learn about yourself and to learn the mysteries of consciousness, in light of what you found, these ram sphinxes outside of the temple were sort of like a butcher who has a picture of a pig on the outside of his place, a little neon pig head, or like a strip club that has a couple of a big double D brassiere on it, that in a way it's an iconic advertisement of what you're going to find inside the shop. And so when we posted these discoveries, we've excerpted the main discoveries to go along with the press releases we're doing, and they're online now. We're posting just the excerpts of the show that show the scientific discoveries. And when you look at those, I was expecting more resistance, frankly. Within the first minute that the thing went up, we started getting comment. And I was really cringing because I know that there's going to be a lot of hate and that there's some segments of people that are going to fight this tooth and nail and claw. But an avalanche of people who were a preponderance of art students, art teachers, a lot of highly educated artists are really resonating with this idea that the artwork was not just there for decoration. It was not just an example or a statement of mastery over stone and sculpture. It served this purpose. It communicated a message. And until you made this series of discoveries, no disrespect to Egyptology, but the world was not aware. These things have been hiding in plain sight. And as a result of what you found, it is no longer possible to dismiss our most ancient ancestors as being primitive in any way. This is incredibly sophisticated brain art. And as you pointed out, it's not just for the sake of biology, but this is particularly illustrating the parts of the brain that produce consciousness.
Yeah, I mean, it's over my own course and experience of all this stuff too. Like I've gotten to the point where I no longer care about the chronology of time. It is obviously relevant, and you get to those Venus statues, and there's 20,000, 30,000, 40,000 years old. So clearly, time is relevant to a degree. But from my own standpoint, it's just, again, like you said, John West sort of 101, and you realize that there's boom and bust, golden ages and dark ages, and this sort of thing. And so I've gotten to the point where I don't care about the chronology of history. All I care about is that this is clearly things that human beings have been able to tap into and have access to as far back as it seems like people have been able to make art. What are they making art about? They're making art about these mysteries. They're making art about the big questions, consciousness. What do we hear? What's the meaning of life? What is the purpose of all of this stuff? And I think it's just made me realize that it's just it's an aspect of being human, of having a human brain, that we're able to tap into something and then to have the ability to. I mean, from an artistic standpoint, I make stuff with a pencil and a piece of paper. If I had to communicate the ideas that I can communicate in a poster out of stone that I can't move and that I can't. I don't know if anybody out there has ever tried to carve something. I tried to carve a human figure one time years ago out of wax, like this hard wax that you use for making sculptures. I'm not a sculptor. It was my first sort of foray into it. And making just a human figure with a head with just shoulders out of a block out of hard wax was surprisingly frustrating, and I gave up relatively quickly. So whenever I see Luxor or Karnak or any of these massive structures built out of stone, and they're carved amazing, they're just brilliant, and it's mind-boggling as an artist to look at that stuff and go, you did this out of stone.
Yeah.
It seems like it would be the worst material possible to choose as an artist, that this is what you're gonna use to make, and even if you carve it, how are you gonna move it? How are you gonna lift it? How are you gonna, it just seems like the last material that you would go to. It just goes to show their intelligence, that they figured, like, not only are we going to pick the hardest material, we're going to make it huge. We're going to make it massive.
Yeah. It also speaks to this really interesting thing that should be of concern to all artists, that any artist is only as important and as timeless as the subject that he chooses. So if you happen to be an artist and you choose the Kardashians or, the latest NASCAR winner, Dale, whatever, Jr., you're going to be a very time-bound artist. But if you can choose for your subject of art timeless principles, you're more likely to be a timeless artist. We're still reading James Joyce, and we're still reading Plato and Socrates, and
still talking about Egypt.
And we're still talking about Egypt. And so the appropriateness of choosing the medium of stone for ideas that are truly timeless. Because fashions come and go, the shapes of hats come and go, the colorful shapes of glasses change from square to round and back again. But the one thing that is a constant is brain structure, and I think the potential structure of consciousness. And so not only we seem to have found well, first of all, what's a notorious blind spot for modern science is where does consciousness come from? What is it? This artwork seems to be drawing our attention to the mechanical bits that produce consciousness, or the way that I've been enjoying saying it lately is the nexus between material and mind, between body and mind. That the places that you've pointed out are being shown in the art are really the nexus point where the meat gives rise to the mind. And there is no place in the brain where Brad resides, little Brad running around behind your eyes, looking out of each eye. There's two Brads, a left Brad and a right Brad.
There's one over here and there's one over here. I listen to that one way more than this guy.
The ventricles represent the nexus between the systems, a conjunction point of the three biological factories, as Brad calls them. It is the nexus between the circulatory system and nervous system. Not only is this sacred space the nexus between biological systems, but in a very real sense, it is the nexus between biology and consciousness. It seems to be the crossover point where body gives rise to mind. The idea of the nexus is another one of those ideas that the cultural aesthetic expressed and clearly held in high regard. The practice of crossing the arms of the deceased as part of the funerary process was symbolically associated with this crossover between the internal and external worlds. The modern specialized science that tracks this complicated interaction at this nexus point is called neuroendocrinology.
And this connection of the central nervous system to the endocrine system is what is referred to as neuroendocrinology, and it is through neuroendocrinology where the physiological functions of the body are regulated. The anatomy and functionality of the neuroendocrinological physiology of the body is one of the main keys to unlocking and understanding the teaching of this ancient esoteric wisdom tradition.
So you get people that just are so offended by the presumption of anyone who's going to forward science that they throw something at you that's, I hear this quite a bit, not a lot, but I hear it enough that it bothers me, that there's this idea of confirmation bias. That someone might say, I'm looking at clouds and I see an Indian and I see a scorpion and I see a bicycle. And there is definitely something to confirmation bias. I mean, anyone can look in the clouds and everyone's seen a fluffy bunny rabbit in the sky. A lot of people have seen Jesus in a piece of toast or a tortilla or something, right? There is definitely such a thing as confirmation bias. But there is also this long-standing tradition in art, and it's covered by the science of, it's escaping my mind right now. I'll think of this word, semiotics, the science of semiotics. There's the signifier and the signified. So graphic designers, especially like way before I was in television, I had to do a lot of interface design and computer interface design and any kind of graphic design, any kind of sign making. You're engaged in the science of semiotics that we know just instinctually when we see an 8-sided red octagon that has a meaning, and it doesn't have anything to do with the intrinsic nature of octagons or the color red. So that's a kind of clumsy example of semiotics. But when you are at a bar and you have to pee, and you go and there's two doors there, and one has an icon of a man that looks nothing like a man. No man's head is fully detached from his body. No women wear that triangular dress that I've ever seen.
Right.
And yet there's this long-standing tradition that you can say, oh, that man could be anything. That can be a hot dog and a piece of, whatever. It can be anything.
Right.
I see, whatever. I see a whatever. But in the context of this form of visual communication, we can take this simplistic form, and through the art of semiotics, we know that that's the signifier, and what it signifies is if you're a dude, go in this door to go to the bathroom. And that there's this snap of confirmation that happens, like when you solve a puzzle or when you get a joke or when music really works or it doesn't. And so I want to address this idea that what is the metric, in your opinion, that distinguishes between confirmation bias and just plain confirmation? I know with these alignments, when you say this looks like a brainstem, it's not just, hey, this kind of reminds me of a brainstem. You go into correlations where you'll show 15, 20, like one correlation. You can call it coincidence. 2 correlations, oh, it's an Indian and the Indian has a hat. But when you get into 5 and 10 and 20 correlations, and if it's specifically in a context, like, the sperm cell in Luxor, there's a sperm cell there, it's called the water of life. It's coming out of the penis of the pharaoh, specifically in the context telling the story of the birth of the king. And so a person with a really pedantic traditional mindset would automatically say, well, that can't be a sperm cell because they didn't know what sperm cells look like, and therefore that can't be a sperm cell, which is terrible logic and it's bad science, but we hear that a lot. Maybe I've already trampled over this too much, but talk about how you know the difference between confirmation bias and an actual confirmation of semiotic correlation between an image and what it is intended to represent.
Yeah, well, and it's something to definitely consider, because there's a lot of times where people will say that, where if you're looking for something, and you can put it in there, like you said, you look at images of clouds, and maybe all of a sudden every time I look at clouds, I'm seeing, oh, that's brain anatomy. Whatever you're hyper focused on is going to be the thing that you're going to try and interject into, everything you're looking at. And I have thought about that, and I think some of it that I realized is that there are multiple instances. If it was just the Venus of Willendorf, then you'd only have one that to stand on. But there's multiple ones of them. And there's other Venus figurines that, to me, just look like female bodies. I can't say that they're necessarily brainstem or look like brain anatomy. The ones that we do show in the series, I feel like look like brain stems to me.
You do a remarkable job. You do a really remarkable job, especially with the case of the Ishtar statue, where you acknowledge that, yes, bulbous hips have always been around, and maybe bulbous hips are synonymous with fertility, but you don't often see these big, crazy, bulbous shoulders that happen to correspond exactly with the thalamus and so you've done a really good job.
You don't see that in human beings, though.
Yeah, you never see that.
Even if you see an obese person, they don't have these they don't have elephantitis of the shoulders. That's not a feature. But the other thing I was going to say is, we've only really presented in this the first series the visual confirmations. You can then get past confirmation bias when you get into the mythology and the stories behind Inanna and the stories behind Ishtar and the stories behind Artemis and the mythology and the symbolism. When you get into the symbolism of those characters that are these statues are made of, they also tie into aspects of physiology. With Artemis and Sybil and Diana and that stuff, often they're considered, the queens of heaven, the ladies of heaven. They're considered, and as we've talked about, this idea of heaven being the higher place up, and the heavenly vault is the head.
Right.
So these ideas of the queens of heaven ties them to the head. They're often associated with the moon. The moon is associated with the mind. You can start adding on to not only just are these just visually similar. So that idea of just because it looks like that doesn't mean it is that. You can keep building the support for that case once you start going into the symbology and the mythology behind it. And have you ever heard of this guy named Tony Nader, Nader? He was a neuroscientist, and he wrote a book about how, I think this is in the 90s, about how the physiology of the human body is represented in the Vedic text of the Ramayana. And he's the first person to show, as far as I've seen, that, you ever seen the images where they show Ganesh, the elephant god, next to the brain? He was the person who made that correlation. That's another one of those things that gets thrown up online all the time and nobody cites it, in the same way that the Gary gets everybody rips off that image of his and the showing the Eye of Horus and the brain, and nobody cites him. Tony Nader, I think, was the first person to show that image of Ganesh. But he's versed in Vedic mythology, and he's a neuroscientist who I think taught it at MIT and Harvard. I don't know enough about his whole background, but he's able to, since he understood Vedic mythology, he was able to show how that Vedic mythology and the characters in the Ramayana correlate to human physiology and correlate to human parts to parts of the brain, and how characters are representing this part of the brain and this, that, and the other thing. So it's stuff like that where you go, it's no longer just these are similar shapes. It's the stories and the symbols and the motifs and these other things that are adding to it, so you can, to a degree, get rid of confirmation bias. I could be wrong about any of the things that we've presented, but I feel like I can present a solid case on multiple fronts, other than just this looks like that.
Yeah.
And even the Michelangelo painting on the Sistine Chapel, it clearly looks like a brain. But there's also there's a motif and there's a theme going on there, which is God is reaching out and making contact with man, and Sophia is coming out of the center of the brain. So it's not just a story of it's not just Michelangelo going, hey, look, that's what the human brain looks like. He's telling you the power that the human brain has to make these bigger connections and to make it's not just like we've said, it's not just biology for the sake of biology. It's not just someone going, hey, I cracked open a skull and this is what I found inside of it, And so I think and going back to what you're saying before too about this nexus point, I think that's something that's important to talk about. Is in almost every esoteric religion is this point of the union of duality, the resolution of duality. And I feel like in too much of this community where people are interested in consciousness and that sort of thing, they disregard the body. And they and I've done it in the past too, where you talk about the meat suit, that I'm more than just this body. I'm this much bigger. When my body dies, I'm going to keep going on and that stuff. But again, I think there's that you have to resolve mind and body. You can't have the opposing polarity of the two and say I'm this but I'm not this. You're both. Talk about the little Brad running around in here. I'm in here somewhere, somehow, this physical body and people get so angry at the materialists and the scientists who are so focused on material, but we are material, and we do have this, and so I think you need to resolve the duality of mind and body and put them into one, and which we are, and I don't necessarily know where consciousness, how it operates. None of us really seem to know where does it come from, how does it operate? But it clearly seems to be from all of our ancestors in this artwork that they're talking about consciousness in relationship to the brain. Does that mean the brain is generating consciousness? Who knows? But it's definitely showing that this is an important look here. Go to here and look, and this is where this is important. So.
Did you get that Stanford? There was a really remarkable. I'm surprised that people didn't make a bigger deal about it. That there was an announcement from Stanford University that somebody in cognitive sciences, somehow with PET or squid imaging or neural network analysis or something, they've made a statement that they're fairly confident now about the very early phases of understanding where consciousness arises from. And it was, as you predicted, and as the art predicted, the central brain stem. So we've talked a lot, and I frequently evangelize about how the left and right hemisphere science has been rectified, and it's come roaring back through the agency of Ian McGilchrist and his amazing book, Master and His Emissary. I've been talking to Tony Wright quite a bit lately, just bottomlessly interesting character. And he's talked to Ian. He's had better experience with McGilchrist returning his calls and stuff than we have. But the point of this was, it fell out of fashion for a while in the 70s that, the left brain does this and the right brain does this. And then science kind of turned its back on that idea. But he rectified the model and kind of brought it back to its prestige, and that it is really legitimate that you have these eternally paired adversaries in your left and right hemisphere, checks and balances and whatnot. And that it really makes a kind of satisfying sense that the you that's outside of you, because there's something that's looking at your thoughts. There's something generating thoughts, and you have your Republicans and Democrats in your head fighting across the aisle, but there's a third person that's sitting back and observing that. And so, it's a big thing in Gurdjieffianism that self-observation and observe the observer that's observing yourself. And it suggests this third thing. Gary Osborne is all about the third force of consciousness, too, that you have this very definitive left hemisphere consciousness and right hemisphere. The reason I keep wanting to bring up right brain, by the way, and I should have brought this up when we were talking about confirmation bias, there's something about artists, graphic designers, visual artists, all kinds of visual, aesthetic-based people. We've spent our lives working this bicep of the right hemisphere, the visual-spatial relationship thing, and the muscle for creativity, for creating something out of nothing. But pattern recognition in artists and in musicians, oddly enough, because they rely so heavily on the right brain, for right hemisphere dominant people, or for people who have a non-atrophied right brain, they look at these presentations we're making and it's obvious to them. But for people who have a little small raisin for their right hemisphere, a little atrophied right brain, which society hugely rewards. Our society is all about the left brain. I just started working out again, and I can't think in the gym because they force me to listen to this ridiculous pop music. And if you go out to eat lunch, they pump music at you, and everything in society is all about keeping you from ever being introspective. I think that's why the neo-shamanistic culture is so important, because it's so discouraged to use your right hemisphere. And as we've talked about, if you work on a furniture assembly line, or if you're in a car manufacturing plant, and you're like, today I'm going to do something different. I'm going to go whimsical today with the way I put this chair together or the way I put this car together. That's not cool for mass production. And there's lots of reasons why the industrialized society discourages right brain activity. And even people have this really nasty bias about people that are right-brained are unreliable and they don't show up on time and they're just flakes, never minding that the reason you were able to get into a car is because of a right-brained guy, or the reason you're able to listen to your radio is because of right-brained people. But anyway, I was really empowered and very glad to find this wave of right-brained people who instantly got the discoveries that we're presenting. And it tends to be people who are just noticeably, painfully left-brained that say, oh, that's not it. That's just confirmation bias.
I think the other thing about that, too, is this idea. I think the left brain wants the pattern to be exact. And I think the right, like a lot of these, like the Venus all of this stuff it's similar composition. It's not exact, but it's close. Like, I mean, like the whoever it's supposed to be, the Karnak Ramses as Osiris underneath the ram's head. I mean, the shapes are similar. It's the composition that's similar. And so from an artist, I can look at another. I've had this happen to me where I'll make a poster for a band, and another artist makes a poster, and we have similar compositions. It's not the same thing, but our layout is very similar. And so it's that ability to look at patterns and go, oh, those are similar. This is similar here. This is similar here. That's similar here. And I think the left hemisphere wants it to be totally congruent, like some sort of mathematical proof where, triangle ABC is congruent to triangle XYZ, because you can prove it with all of this stuff. So I think some of that is that left hemisphere is that it says, well, that doesn't look like that, or I don't see, they're not the same.
It's
Clearly,
a really
they're
good
different.
point. The need for literalness. The left brain loves the familiar and it loves literalness. The right brain is the domain of humor and music and metaphor. That's a really important word in what we're doing. The thing that you're talking about in particular, the horns of Amun, Khnum is the potter's wheel, and he's the one with those really spirally long horns. He's the one that takes the potter's clay and puts the fire in it, which is a metaphor for our body with the fire of consciousness inside. And so when one of the next scripts we're working on is called The Perfect Black. It's based on one of Aaron's chapters in his awesome book, Alchemical
By the
Traditions.
way, I grabbed that book when you emailed me about that. There's only a couple of, because it's it's just a couple of chapters from different authors. Yeah. And I had only read a couple of them by Eusebius. I can never pronounce
August Eusebius. Yeah, he's amazing.
amazing. Everything I read of his stuff, I'm just blown away. But I read Aaron's The Perfect Black chapter.
Isn't that something?
It's marked up to shit. I've underlined everything. There's so much in there that is just brilliant.
Well, that's our next script.
I'm so glad you mentioned it to me.
Yeah, I'm glad you're resonating with that. That's literally the next script we're going to do. So what that is all about is Amun, the hidden one, who resides in the perfect black. And you know where the perfect black is. And so the point of this is that this is artwork that was clearly created by right brain people for right brain people. So if you've ever, I don't know how long ago this was, or if it's still a thing, but remember those posters with all the speckles, and if you did the right thing with your eyes, you'd eventually see this 3D shape? Yeah. I know so many people that think that's an elaborate conspiracy and that everyone's pranking them because they just can't make it work, and they just will not believe that there's really a shape there, and they really, I know a couple people who think it's an elaborate prank on them, that there's no such thing, because they can't do it, they can't make it work. Genetically, some people can roll their tongue and some people can. There's an actual gene that allows you to do it. Some people can't do it. Some people are so left hemisphere dominant that they cannot understand metaphor. They have a terrible sense of humor. They're awful at music. And they get mad at the suggestion that a ram and these horns and Amun, the hidden one, and all the context that you were talking about all build to create this visual and ideological metaphor, and that the gods themselves are metaphors for aspects of the psyche. And just like, the Kabbalistic tree of life is this nested series of triads. If you've ever seen a tree of life, it's a structure of triads. And all the gods were born in triads, and they all have these relationships in threes. And I think you could graph the gods directly onto the tree of life. I'm sure somebody in the OTO or in the, what's that great Rota deck? There's some really good tarot decks where they synthesize, what's that called? Anyway, where you synthesize all the different mystery traditions. And it all seems to work out. And so instead of thinking of these things as primitive, idiotic stories about gods who are doing ridiculous things, if you think of each god as an aspect of consciousness or a physical phenomena that gives rise to consciousness, then you understand that these gods are fantastically sophisticated and very approachable metaphors that create this dynamic model of consciousness. And I just started really thrilling myself with the idea that, every time you buy a new piece of electronics, or I buy a guitar pedal or something, and you sit with the owner's manual, you buy a new weed eater, and you sit with the owner's manual for a minute. The most complicated equipment there is, we never got an owner's manual for, and nobody's ever explained to us hidden functions and what happens when you go into high gear, and how do you get it out of neutral. And then you look at the mystery traditions, and this really represents the long-lost owner's manual to the human psyche. And this key that you've discovered in the art is the thing that opens the door to this, really what might be a whole new paradigm in human history of finally understanding the one thing that science can't explain.
You can start seeing how in the ram sphinxes of Karnak, you start to see this terminal figure in Osiris. And you start to see the terminal figure in the brainstem. You start to see this kind of humanoid figure that's in the brainstem. And again, if you look at Gerard David's painting of the Transfiguration of Christ, we see that again. We see this figure, this human figure underneath the brain, or holding up the brain. And the more I started to look at the cerebral crust and these images, I started to recognize a form from art history, another classical form that seemed to be pretty undeniably depicting brain anatomy. What you're seeing right here, these little hands, what look to be like little hands, are the trigeminal nerves. And the trigeminal nerves branch off into 3 different nerves that go and deal with other facial function, and things like biting and chewing and parts of your eye and your jaw and things like that. But in order to cut the brainstem out of the brain, you have to kind of cut these nerves off. And when people illustrate the brainstem, they also kind of cut these nerves off that give you these kind of little 3-fingered hands. The minute that I saw this plastic model of the brainstem doing this pose, I recognized it right away. That pose is a famous pose from the statue of Artemis of Ephesus, or Diana. And it right away, I looked at that and I went, man, that's a brainstem. It's undeniably the pose of the brainstem with the hands being out like this, showing you the trigeminal nerve. And as we can see in these statues that you oftentimes see with these, there's multiple variations of this style of statue, of this pose, of this multi-breasted or the bull testicle, whatever people think these multiple breast-like shapes are. Whenever you see that statue, she has this kind of weird halo or this weird partition on the side of her head that doesn't really make any sense, that seems kind of strange from an artistic composition. But again, if you look at it as brain anatomy, you can start to see that on the side of the head is again that cerebral crus. And you can start to see it in any of these variations of this statue. She usually is depicted with some sort of partition behind her head. And I think it's pretty safe to say that that is the cerebral crus. Her hands are the trigeminal nerves. Her torso is the pons, and her legs are the medulla oblongata. And she is also, the Artemis or Diana of Ephesus, is considered to be a terminal figure. And she's got these kind of nondescript legs that go into a torso of a human figure. The more images that I saw of brain anatomy, I started looking at these trigeminal nerves, and I started coming across images of the brainstem that was drawn in a different way or from a different angle. And I started to recognize this particular pose where you see these trigeminal nerves going up like this, and you have this base legs, and you have this torso, and you have this head with the 2 eyes, and you have sort of a hat. I realized looking at that again, I had seen this pose before, and I had seen it in images of Ishtar. And this particular image of Ishtar is from what's called the Ishtar vase, and it's from the 2nd millennium BC. And it's a crude sort of drawing as far as all the other, or carving, it's a crude carving, and as far as some of the other artifacts go, it's a much more primitive, simplistic version of this. But she's striking the same pose as you can see in this rendering of the brainstem, with these hands kind of up in the air, and she's got this pointed crown. Now, this is another more well-known image of Ishtar, and she's doing this exact same sort of pose, and she also has this kind of pointed cap, which is considered what they call the tiara of divinity. And when you look, that tiara of divinity, where she has this kind of rimmed hat, you can also see in brain anatomy that the way that the optic chiasm forms this kind of hat, it's the same sort of way that this tiara of divinity is depicted. And it makes this kind of pointed hat on her. So this is just another example showing that these poses, the more that I was looking at brain anatomy, the more that I instantly recognized familiar poses and shapes and composition. And it just seemed, again, sort of undeniable to me that what I was looking at was not representations of goddesses or demons, or she has, oftentimes people think with Ishtar that she is this winged demon with these bird feet and that she's somehow sort of some bad sort of person. I started to realize that these were just representations of brain anatomy, and the posture of them was really what gave them away. And I think this is a prime example where you can kind of see this very similar human form making that sort of stance. And when I started looking for more images about Ishtar and more artifacts and more artwork based around Ishtar, there's a well-known statue of Ishtar that is showing not the front of the brainstem, but the back side of the brainstem, the dorsal view. And when I started looking at this image of this artist's rendering of the brainstem, I instantly could see this statue of Ishtar. And this, where she's holding her breast like this, is even referred to as the Ishtar pose. And she's got this necklace that the necklace is sitting right between her breasts, and it sits exactly in the same place that the pineal gland sits. And you can see that she has these bizarre bulbous shoulders and these bizarre bulbous hips, which a lot of times people associate these big bulbous hips with fertility. But I don't think anybody would ever associate bulbous shoulders with fertility. It's sort of a bizarre feature to depict in artwork, and actually her whole body is very bizarre. But when you look at the backside of the brainstem, you get a very similar sort of shape. You get her shoulders are the thalamus. Her hands and her arms are also parts of the brain. Her hands would be the inferior colliculus, and her arms would be the brachium of the superior colliculus and the superior colliculus. And so you see this very similar form and shape for this very peculiar rendering of a human being. And now on the back side of the brainstem, the cerebellum hangs off the back, and it is attached to the brainstem via what's called the cerebral peduncle. These areas right in here, that kind of would make her hips. If you're dissecting a brain and you want to remove the brainstem, you have to cut off the many different parts. You've got to cut off sort of the nerves from the trigeminal nerves. You've got to dissect around it. And if you're going to remove the brainstem, you got to cut off the cerebellum. And so that's where you get this big bulbous hips. And even in her knees, she's got these kind of peculiar knees, which you can see her right here in the vagal trigone. And this was just another prime example to me that our ancient ancestors weren't just creating artwork about fertility, but they were creating artwork showing anatomy that deals specifically with consciousness, that deals specifically with the brain and how consciousness works.
As if it weren't enough that he traced this sophisticated science all the way back to ancient Egypt, Brad continued to follow the clues and kept pulling the thread that unravels the sweater. What Brad discovered next was one for the history books. He traced the clues back to a date so remote in human history it makes the imagination real, and certainly upsets more than a few apple carts.
So when I started to realize that Ishtar statue with these big bulbous hips and this weird sort of female figure was a brainstem, it quickly made me think of one of the most famous sort of statues that you learn about in art history. In fact, in the art history classes that I took, it was the very first statue, the very first work of art that they teach you about in art history class. And I started to see more images of different variations of renderings of brain anatomy, and I came across this particular kind of wireframe stock imagery of the brainstem, and immediately I recognized this shape right in the middle as being extremely close and similar to the Venus of Willendorf statues, which are some of the earliest works of art of human history that go all the way to the Upper Paleolithic era. And the more I was looking at this, I had to compare it to an actual Venus statue, and it seemed to be almost identical in the shape of her body. And you have these kind of big wide hips, and the thalamus being these two halves of the thalamus. There's been at least I think 100 Venus statues found all over Europe. But when I was looking at this wireframe rendering of the brainstem, it seemed to be, again, almost undeniable that this shape, even the shape of her belly, it was showing a work of art that's from 28,000 to 25,000 BC, and it's depicting brain anatomy, and that was sort of an interesting revelation, and almost seemed kind of difficult to comprehend because it doesn't seem to fit in with our normal understanding of what we've been told about history. And so I started to look more at this Venus statue. I started to realize there was aspects of the Venus statue, the Venus of Willendorf in particular, that I hadn't noticed before, which is that she has arms. And I had never caught that in art history class, but she's got these spindly, disproportionate arms that she's resting on top of her breasts. And they don't fit her bulbous body shape at all. They're really skinny and sort of out of place. And again, it just made me think back to the trigeminal nerve. It made me think about the fact that these arms are coming right out of the pawns. And in the Artemis and Diana statues, they're kind of at her side. But when you look at images of the trigeminal nerve, they're sticking out of the pons, and then they go out and do the nerves go out to the face, and they do these other things. But so there's other Venus statues that have been found throughout Europe, and if you look at other of the Venus statues, you start to see other things that kind of clue you in to brain anatomy as well. But so you can look at the back of this Venus of Willendorf and see these lines on the back of what would be her legs, and they tie in extremely similarly to the lines that appear on the back of the brainstem. Now, there's some people that have suggested that these lines are representative of a skirt or a dress. But in my mind, I think that seems kind of strange because you don't see them carrying around to the front of her legs. You just see them on the backside of her legs. And again, we see it's more subtle on the Kostenki Venus, but you see these lines happening back here. And again, in both of these Venuses, you see this sort of bulbous rear end. You see these big bulbous butts. And that would again be the place where the cerebellum attaches to the cerebral pentacle and makes this kind of, overly large hip shape. And we see that in all the Venus statues for the most part, is that they have these strange, large back ends that tie in extremely well to where the cerebral pentacles attach to the cerebellum. Now, the oldest Venus of them all is the Venus of Holofernes, and it's considered to be 35 to 40,000 years old. And when I was looking at this one in particular had some dead giveaways that it was representing brain anatomy. And if you look at all these different representations of brain stems, you'll start to notice that the pons, the bulbous sort of torso section that we've been talking about, always seems to have these sort of striations or these stripes. Different people render them different ways. And if you look at a photograph like here, you'll see that those stripes are there. The artists are rendering what they're looking at. And if you look at the Holofernes Venus, you can still see these same sort of ribbony striations that go across the stomach of the Venus. And another interesting point about this Venus is that where the vagina would be on the Venus is exactly where the anterior median fissure is in the brain, right here on the medulla oblongata. And there's even sort of a dark spot directly right there where the pons and the medulla oblongata kind of meet, and you see a sort of very similar sort of darker spot right where the vagina of this Venus begins. So the more that I looked at this Venus, and again, this is the oldest work of art representing a human figure that we've found. I think it's not that difficult to associate this imagery with brain stems, with brain anatomy.
If the very first, or at least the oldest yet found art, carries this ancient and thus far secret message, and one of such a sophisticated scientific nature, then what we've always thought of as art and its place in primitive culture, in fact the very notion of a primitive culture, instantly flips, restructures itself, and takes a new place on the map of meaning. Another example of ancient art that provides evidence of a missing chapter in history, and in the history of science.
The more I started to familiarize myself with brain anatomy, and the more I started to recognize shapes and forms in classical works of art, this point really just kept coming back and kept coming back, that our ancient ancestors knew far more about not only brain anatomy, but they knew about and brain anatomy that was dealing specifically with consciousness, as we've seen in Michelangelo's painting of the creation of Adam and Gerard David's painting of the transfiguration of Christ. Artists were not only depicting brain anatomy, but they were depicting brain anatomy in relationship to divinity, in relationship to God. And these Venus statues are doing the same thing. And the artwork that we're seeing showing brain anatomy isn't just doing it for the sake of facts and just cataloging this is what parts of the brain look like. They're doing it for a very specific reason, to highlight this knowledge that we all carry this mechanism and this machine work in our brains, in our bodies, in our heads, that is able to connect us to higher levels of consciousness, that's able to give us a receiver to receive higher levels of consciousness and to expand and unfold. And some people might call that higher level of consciousness God. Some people might call it just enlightenment. But whatever you want to call it, I think we can clearly show from the artwork of our ancestors that they were trying to communicate something to us about how each one of us is capable of reaching these higher levels of consciousness and reaching these higher states of being. That whole idea that the kingdom of God dwells within you. The body is a temple. These sort of things you start to realize are not just fancy sayings that we like to say, but they are scientific truths about how human beings operate and how our consciousness operates within this body, and that the body is not something to be cast aside, but that the body in itself is a vehicle for the transformation and the unfoldment of consciousness.
It might be correctly said that the ancient science conveyed timeless truths about the nexus or connection point between mind and body, or consciousness and the physical universe.
From what I have found, a major tenet, if not the main tenet, of the mystery school teachings was this science of consciousness, was this science of understanding how human beings achieve a higher state. These Venus figurine statues weren't just about fertility, but they were about brain anatomy, and not only just about brain anatomy, but about brain anatomy that deals specifically with consciousness.
So our suspicions about a scientific encryption in ancient art and architecture were beginning to look like they were on solid ground, and that there was going to be a significant bit of evidence that would testify to a missing chapter in the history of science and in human culture. Ancient art proved to be an unexpected doorway to ancient science. But the science seemed to be intimating or indicating a deeper mystery still. What if this culture has been grossly misunderstood? And what we've been thinking of as proto-religious symbols are actually these ingeniously approachable schematics of consciousness itself. What if this were not proto-religion, but something more akin to a science? A science that focuses on the other universe, the inner universe of consciousness. Could it be that these surface symbols, the netters and their relationships with one another, were actually schematics of a sort? Ingenious dynamic models that describe the most fundamentally important thing that a person can know, the mysteries of one's own consciousness, the nature of consciousness, and the place that consciousness occupies in the material world. What if, instead of a nonsensical bunch of proto-religious gibberish, this culture was expressing an ancient and lost science?
Modern society seems to be metaphorically illiterate. Nobody would ever look at every New Year's, you have Father Time and the baby of the new year coming in. Nobody would ever think that those are real, supposed to represent that there's really an old man with a sickle and there's really a baby. We understand those as the passing of time, right? We understand that metaphor of that. But like people do, like the idea of from an artist's point of view, if I want to express something in some sort of abstract concept, but the idea of these animal-headed gods or these bird-headed beings, if you take that literally, you've stripped it completely of all of its artistic symbolism and all of its artistic metaphor. The idea of the Horus or the winged philosopher, or this idea of flying higher to a higher level of getting higher perception. The eagle eye or the hawk eye. And I think we are. I think we are metaphorically illiterate, and I think I think our modern society is left hemisphere. I think Tony probably takes us more than Ian McGilchrist does, but this idea that we're going through sort of a left hemisphere dementia as a society, and even like you were talking about this idea of introspection. Our phones and the computer have stripped introspection away entirely every time. And I'm just as guilty. I do it too. We all do. But you go out into the world, and every time that people used to have to kill time or to, like, if you're sitting at a bar, you go into a bar and there's people at the bar who are on their phones and or you go to the bus stop. And I get it. I would do the same thing. If I had a hard day of work and I'm killing time, or I don't want to be involved in having the commute going home. Or even just like DVD players in the back seats of car. When you were a kid driving across a road trip, you had to use your brain and you had to be introspective and kill that time. And so we've moved into a period of time where, because we've connected to technology, we've disconnected with introspection, and we don't have. And you can even see that in artwork where you aren't seeing as much creativity. You're seeing reboots and rehashes of things. So original ideas are becoming harder and harder. You're not seeing them as much anymore. And have you ever heard of the hypogeum in Malta? I'm going to probably say wrong. The Salflieni hypogeum. It's the oldest underground cave structure, and I think that they've found it's 4,000. It's like 4,000 BC. And there's a room in there called the Oracle Chamber, and they've done experiments in there where they found out where the chambers in that underground structure are resonated at different frequencies, and they found from 90 hertz to about 120 hertz is where these frequencies are. Wow! And they studied with EGGs,
electroencephalograms. EEGs.
Yes, EEGs. Yeah, I just said egg. That's why EGGs. They use eggs.
The yolk, especially.
But they've done studies where they've used those same frequencies between 90 hertz and 120 hertz, and they've found exactly what you said, is that it affects people's psyche and their emotion, and more so than that, it switches from left hemisphere over to right hemisphere. Wow. And it sort of strips people of language, and not only does that, people have. They've asked in these studies where they've done this in a lab where they put people under and they've given them these tones that they see images and they have experiences and stuff like that. So there is something about this idea of the right hemisphere having some sort of significance, even though, like, from those studies where they talk about with where they've observed brains with people who are on acid, on LSD. That the whole brain seems to operate as more of a unified front, yeah. And I think that's part of the process, is that you are, and McGilchrist talks about that the corpus callosum that connects the two hemispheres actually inhibits it's stopping more than it's allowed communication to happen between the two of them. And so I think there is something to be said about a unified brain, but there's something going on in the right hemisphere. And McGilchrist, he was actually one of the emails I was able to get back from him. He talks about how they're different. The right and left hemispheres are structurally different. They're not identical. They're not symmetrical. They respond to hormones differently. They respond to neurotransmitters differently. So they're different systems. They're not identical. It's not just a mirrored pair of the two. And I think as well that when I look at when you listen to McGilchrist talk about what a left hemisphere dominant society would look like, he's describing our modern society. He's describing, and even the point too that you talk about where people want to say left hemisphere, people want to say there's confirmation bias in looking at this stuff. He tells that interesting story where when you go see people in the hospital who've just had a stroke in their right hemisphere, and so their left hemisphere is all that's really working. You go up to them and you say, "How are you feeling?" And they say, "I'm fine." And they don't really register that anything has happened that's bad. And they say, "Oh, well, move your left arm." And they go, "There, I just did. I just moved it." And they hadn't moved it. And they say, they'll lift up the arm and show it to them and say, "No, this is your left arm. You didn't move it." And their left hemisphere says, "No, that's the guy in the next bed. That's not my arm."
Wow.
And there's this interesting idea that he talks about where the left hemisphere, the right hemisphere understands the things it doesn't know, and that the left hemisphere thinks it knows everything and it's fine. That's the
won't acknowledge it or will actively lie to you to pretend it knows. Yeah.
Right. And I think even when you look in our society now where people refuse to listen to ideas that they disagree with, they're intelligent people who are unwilling to be confronted with ideas that they that idea, like, I hear what you're saying, but we were just going to agree to disagree, or that's not something that seems to be happening anymore. I think the more I look out at this world, I think you could make a case for left hemisphere dementia that has swept across humanity, and maybe it's just one of those things where the pendulum, there's cycles of things, and you go from a right hemisphere dominant world at some point and it swings to the far left hemisphere dominant, and maybe you get those points, those golden ages where there's the middle. But I think, and there's a Venus of Lassell. I'm not going to Laussel, I think, and it's carved. It's not a standalone. It's carved into some surface, but it's a Venus figurine, that hipped woman, and she's holding a horn in her right hand, and there's other instances of that. What's the sheep go to heaven, goats go to hell. The sheep sit on the right side and the goats are on the left side and they go to hell. There's a lot of other examples of this. That scaffolding, that etching that's on the wall in Rosslyn Chapel. There's a bowl at the top of this scaffolding, and there's a star on the right side of the bowl. So you see that a lot. You see the right side being sort of addressed with things.
That statue that I love so much that is featured really prominently in Magical Egypt that John called the reconciling element, where the pharaoh is the middle and Horus is literally pointing to the right hemisphere and Set pointing to the left, which is the same as the tarot. I don't know how up you are on the tarot, but the charioteer is in a carriage and he has a right sphinx and a left sphinx, and they're inverse of one another, and the legend is, if you ever lose control of the sphinxes, they'll come and eat you. But
isn't one white, black? There's a white one and a black one.
Yeah.
Well, even like we were just talking about, the devil sits on your left shoulder and the angel sits on your right shoulder. Wow. So Set is on the left, and Horus is on the right, and that's the interesting thing about the Semiotawe too, is that idea of that conflict, that conflict between the upper and the lower, right? That you have to unify these two things. And I think, if anything, hopefully through us discussing some of this stuff, there can be more of a conversation about left hemisphere dementia. Because I think when I look out at the world and listening to McGilchrist and Tony Wright and that stuff, you can see it. You can see how the left hemisphere creates it's great for mechanical, for technicality, for all of these amazing technology that we have, but it's the right hemisphere is that bigger picture one that helps you connect and even just the story of the master and his emissary, where the emissary has decided he no longer needs the master, and he is the master. It's that again, that left hemisphere that's saying, I don't need the right hemisphere. I got this, right? I don't need you. Stay out of it.
Tony Wright talks about how funny it is that the insane hemisphere is the one that's measuring how insane we are, and it keeps saying, no, everything's fine. Everything's great. Do you know, I don't know if you're a Gurdjieff guy, but there was this metaphor that Gurdjieff used to talk about the horse and carriage, where the actual physical carriage is your body, the horses are your emotions, the carriage driver has the illusion that he's steering the carriage, but he doesn't know where he's going, and the passenger inside the carriage actually knows the destination. So if any one of those are broken, you're not going to travel. If your physical body doesn't work, you're not going to get anywhere. If the horses are in charge, if your emotions are calling the shots, you're very quickly going to veer off of a ravine. The chariot, the driver of the carriage is in charge in most cases, but he doesn't know where he's going. So he just wanders around aimlessly under the illusion that he's controlling the carriage. And when all three of them are put in service of the passenger, then you actually arrive at your destination. One of those typically brilliant Gurdjieff models. Speaking of right brain, by the way, I mentioned something in one of the early episodes. I don't remember which one, and I wish I'd gone into it a little more. That the Indian mandala, the colored mandala that the Tibetan monks make, and there was a Russian team, a cognitive science team in Russia, and I'll post the report because it's amazing. They've studied, and this was a legitimate scientific study, they've showed through all these double-blind tests that 2 minutes of looking at a mandala without any chemicals, without any other stimuli, will completely shift the emphasis from left to right hemisphere within 2 minutes. That the point of these mandalas, and the colors and the geometry and the synthesis of everything, it's like TV before TV, only TV that is good for you, that it literally, you just sit and stare at your mandala, and everything shifts. I've been having these nights where I just sit and have fights with imaginary people in my head for hours and hours, and I need to get a mandala.
I do that too. I would crack me up when I'd have an argument in my head with somebody, and I'd be arguing their side and getting mad at them for the stuff that I was making them say, for the words I was putting in their mouth. You know what's funny about the right and left hemisphere thing? When McGilchrist talks about the bird, he uses that. That's the one you and I have both used all the time. It's a great way to describe that the left hemisphere has to be hyper focused on detail because it needs to pick out the food from all the different rocks and gravel and everything else out. And and the right hemisphere has to make sure that they don't become lunch. It has to see the full picture. One of our chickens, the pecking order is real. The chickens are brutal to each other, and one of our chickens, she has her right eye got pecked, and it's always been bad. And it's pretty much she doesn't have use of it anymore. So she's just seeing through her left eye. So it's just her right hemisphere. So I always make the joke whenever I see her that she's the existential hippie bird who's just everything she's doing is she's thinking about the bigger picture of the meaning of life and and all the other chickens are just being chickens. But she's got this am I me? Who are we? What are we as chickens? What is this egg that we're laying? What are we doing? Every time I see her, I feel sort of bad for her because I'm like, she's only got one hemisphere that's intaking information.
Did you name her Horace?
No, but her name is Mildred, and I call her Dread Eye because she has a dread. She has a dead eye, but I call her Dread Mildred, so she's the Dread Eye, and then I think of Jedi. Yeah.
Hilarious. Speaking of collegiates and right and left hemisphere, and just every once in a while when I really want to make myself sick and set my nervous system on fire, I check in with what's going on college campuses. And Camille Paglia, one hyper-intelligent person, has been doing a series of lectures on femininity and female archetypes. And I keep reminding myself to talk to you about this, that she is talking about these early Ishtar and Inanna statues. Did you watch the Discovery video? I mean, you did it, so I know you remember it, but did you watch the Discovery thing recently? We were talking about how nobody really knows why that coat of breasts around the part of her body that corresponds to the pons and the running strip of animals going down. And the reason that made me think of that is this woman admitted that this most iconic of ancient statues is this giant enigma because of these physical anomalies, have you looked into any more of maybe the correlation of the pons, or what is it about the pons on the brainstem that would cause, because obviously women don't have those breasts, and it's an easy thing to say, oh, this is the bountiful nature of womanhood and stuff, but what we've discovered in these artworks is they tend to be quite technical about, here is some symbolic indication of the function of this brain part. Have you done any more research on that?
A little bit. Like I said, I feel like the multiple breasts and the pons is a trickier one. The animals going up the legs, to me, would tie in again to that idea of your lower animal nature, that you have to have your lower base animal passions in control, and that idea that they're running up. Again, there's that movement upward that's going up, and it's going up the brainstem. So there's, to me, and Sybil and Inanna and Artemis are known as the mistress of animals, and so that would be, again, somebody who's in control of their lower base desires, of their lower animal nature. That idea that Pan is, his lower half is the goat half, right? That's the passionate part of you. That's when you give into all of your emotions and all of your desires and that stuff. So my theory on the animals going up the legs would have to do with that concept. And there's on some of them on Artemis, I know she has bees that are up on the running on the side of her leg. And I think it was the Greeks that thought that bees regenerated asexually. And so they considered bees to be sort of symbols of purity and chastity. And that, again, would tie into this idea that you need to preserve you need to not give into your temptations, and you need to not give into these things and save that and bring it up, raise it up. The breasts and the pons, it's tricky because I said obviously the pons doesn't look like that, right? It's not, it doesn't have that, it is of the same, like I said, again, the composition of the shape is this round sort of shape. It obviously doesn't have all of those breasts and all of those bumps. Some people think they're eggs. Some people think they're bees' eggs. Some people think they're bull testes. Some people think they're gourds. Some people, there's all this. Some people think they very well could be breasts. And even that idea of this sort of abundance of fertility, this mother that can feed multiple, it's. I think there's symbolically something to be said about that too, as far as the idea of the fertility of the physiology of the body, that you're nurturing this whole body you have enough to go around for this there's just an endless supply sort of thing, that you can be nourished by this mother goddess. And
I was looking into this the other day and just typed in, what is the function of the pons? What does the pons do? And one of the things it says is it distributes signals from the brain to parts of the body. So the idea of distribution or nurturing is an interesting thing. I'm surprised that some enterprising young fashion designer doesn't create an actual coat of human breasts, silicone. Can you imagine? Or that dispense some kind of liquid of some kind that, I don't know.
That would be creepy.
That would be super creepy, which means someone should do it. Hey, I want to show you something. Speaking of this, I acknowledge in advance that I'm showing you an iteration of your own discovery, but I just started thinking about, tell me when I'm screen sharing. Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
So check this out. When you were talking, well, first of all, when we were looking at the pons, okay, so there's the pons, and there's the brainstem, and as we've shown in the discovery excerpts, your brilliant work pointed out this is a torso, and even in traditional architecture, the terminal figures have the joined legs and the pons and then the face. And if you look at this right, if you look at the olfactory nerves, you can actually see that iconic shape of the Egyptian hat. And so you pointed out in episode 2 or 3 these horizontal striations along the pons. I was sitting in bed the other night, and I realized mummiform Osiris. Osiris the mummy is always depicted in this very specific way where his elbows are up And, the headdress that corresponds to this and the two sides of the corpus callosum. In our excerpt, I think it's discovery number 4, we show that those wings on the side of the Egyptian hat correspond to the corpus callosum, and the two snakes that are there correspond exactly to the amygdala. And that's why those two snakes each have balls on top of their heads, because the amygdala that come out of the side, if you were to cut this again at a cross section where the amygdala is, you see these things that are exactly the shape of those snakes. So I started thinking about the mummiform Osiris, and Ptah is always portrayed as a mummy. So he never has hands, and his legs are always bound together. And that was one of the early, see the mummiform legs corresponding to the pawns. And of all the places, because in Luxor, which is the statue and the symbolism of living man, the arms are down in this very commanding pose, and the legs are noticeably separated. But then when it's talking about mummiform Osiris or mummiform Ptah, you always see this very characteristic thing where his hands are drawn up so that he creates that triangular or rhomboidal. This is interesting too. The monkey, see the bulbs of the monkey corresponding to the bulbs of the thalamus?
Yeah, and that's Jehudi or Thoth too.
Yeah, who is specifically divine inspiration and thought. Thoth, I think, actually is the word thought, and people don't talk about that enough. I think that is the word thought.
I mean, it has to be etymologically
related, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, and then this thing here, there's a sort of a weird pattern. Well, anyway, those striations on the pawns, they're depicted in the aesthetic motifs of all of these mummiform wrappings. And the other thing is, when I was researching just recently, when we were doing all that research about the Ida and Pingala, there's actually this whole thing about your parasympathetic and your sympathetic nervous system. One is the right side of the body and one's the left side of the body, and maybe what was being symbolized by the Ida and Pingala. But I'm sure you probably already know this. The crook and flail, one is to pull towards you and the other is to strike out away from you, and kind of the symbolism of yin and yang, or sympathetic and parasympathetic. And so another example of the aesthetics of the ancients not just being beautiful, but actually representing a scientific schematic. Isn't that cool?
Yeah, or even just the crook and the flail thing, even the idea of pulling towards you things that are good for you and pushing away, again, that like virtue and vice. You want to bring virtue towards you and just, what's that? Get back, Satan.
Right.
I gotta stop using my hands. The other interesting thing that I find out about mummification too, and I think this is some Jeremy had presented this idea, and some other people I've heard present this idea too, though, is the idea of if you're not using mummification to preserve a dead body, but you could be using it to restrict movement in the same way that a caterpillar is restricted and stilled in the cocoon.
Wow.
If you were going into the temple and you're going through some initiation aspect and you have to lay down and not move at all, you could bound somebody up and keep their body still. And anybody who's ever experienced sleep paralysis, which I've experienced a few times,
wow.
You can't move. Your body is completely still. And they talk about the idea of being able to induce sleep paralysis, which is where you can lay down. I've never been able to do it because you fall asleep, but you can, if you lay down perfectly still and you don't move at all, like even like a twitch or move, and they even talk about the idea that even when your eyes are closed, they're making your eyeballs make these micro movements.
Yeah.
And your body goes into sleep paralysis because it doesn't want you to act out your dreams. So you're not legs aren't, you aren't doing all this stuff.
Yes.
Yeah. So when you go to sleep, your body is actually paralyzed. And they say that when you have these sleep paralysis experiences, they're terrifying. But one of the few experiences I've ever described as terrifying, because you wake up from a dream state in your room. You can't move, you can't do anything, but you're still seeing crazy dream-like things happening. And this is the dweller of the threshold. One of the things they always talk about that you see is this dark, shadowy figure, which I think is probably where the cloaked Grim Reaper idea comes from, because it's just a shroud.
Wow.
But I think there's something to be said about the idea that if mummification or restricting or confining somebody can put you into a state where the body is believed, you're tricking the body into making it go to sleep so that all the limbs think it's asleep. And the other interesting thing when they talk about trying to induce sleep paralysis is that I think your body goes through like a pinball machine. You know, when you get the ball gets lost and it can't find the ball, it has to go through every trigger to try and find it. And it just starts hitting mechanisms to try and find the ball.
Oh.
I think the human body does that when you go to sleep. It kind of goes through each system. It's like, all right, are we asleep? Are we sleeping? Or what are we doing? And it, once the body, you can trick the body into thinking that you're asleep. I think it's an interesting theory that Jeremy Nadler, and there's a book called The Lion Path or something like that. It's kind of a weirdo esoteric book, but it brings up that same idea of the caterpillar in the cocoon who is moves so, it's still, it's perfectly still. And there's that idea of, Manly Hall talk about that biblical passage of be still and know that I am God. That idea
Right.
that if you sit, and in meditation's the same idea, is you sit in a pose and you don't move. You're not supposed to move an inch. You're supposed to be perfectly still. So even that idea of like the mummified Osiris, Osiris is going into the underworld. He's the god of the dead, right? And I think if you think about that as a funerary thing and an afterlife thing, that's one aspect of it. But if you think about it as you're going through this into this other realm of consciousness, in order to get there, you have to be, if you were to be mummified or wrapped up, you will still the body and make it think that it's, I think I've told you this before, but there's a movie with Adrian Brody called The Jacket. And he gets put into prison wrongly accused of a crime, but they have this technique, this controversial technique where they're trying to rehabilitate criminals. And they wrap them up in a straitjacket, and they have a neck brace on their neck, and they put them in morgue drawers.
Oh!
And they leave them in there. Unfortunately, the Adrian Brody character, they forget he's in there, and they leave him in there for like 24 hours. If you're claustrophobic, it's not a good movie to watch. But he ends up going to he has these out-of-body experiences. He goes to some other place in his mind, and I think that's sort of the same idea of the initiation of symbolizing death, that you've laid the body to rest, and it allows the consciousness to go to explore and to go to whatever these other realms of consciousness are.
Wow.
I think there's something to be said about the idea that mummification or wrapping the body that's alive is not just for the sake of preserving a corpse. I think, and even in Japan, in the coronation of the emperor, they have a ceremony called the Daijosai, which nobody knows anymore what the symbols do. There's all this in Japan. They even talk about how they don't know what the symbols are for. Or there's two halls that you go into for when the emperor has to become coronated as the emperor, and in each one of the halls are identical, which is kind of interesting when you think about the two hemispheres of the brain, or even like the two halls of Ma'at in
Right.
Egypt. But in each one of the halls is a bed called the Shinza bed. And in Japan, they even say, like, you're not supposed to touch that bed. You're not supposed to do anything with it, and it's considered the God seat.
Wow.
And there's other people that have speculated that it might have been a dream incubation couch, just like the lion couch in Egypt. And they have these wrapped bandages that are on the part of the ceremony too. And again, nobody knows what they're supposed to use for. But one person has speculated that it could have been to wrap the body up. I don't think a lot of people support that his theory, but it goes right into that idea of sleep paralysis, or of suspending the body to the point that you don't move. And I think it's the same thing with float tanks. The idea is that you float the body so that you're lulling the body into thinking it's asleep, and that triggers that third state that Gary talks about, that hypnagogic, that other part of our brains that we're capable of doing. So if Osiris and all these things is mummified and wrapped up, there could be something more to it than just being like, oh, this is a god of the dead. This is what we do with our dead. We wrap them up, and not saying that they didn't do that, because obviously they did mummify bodies and preserve them, and It does seem to preserve bodies, but I think
that's a real interesting point that you make about the cocooning for insects too, that it's necessary to go into a cocoon for this transformation. That's huge. metaphorical and biological. That's awesome.
Well, and then, but even the idea of, well, it's not even mine. That's stuff that I've read from other people. But the idea that you then have wings, that the butterfly is now has this other dimension that it gets to traverse through. It's no longer landlocked. It gets to fly, and it gets to experience. It'd be like if you were a kid and you didn't have a car. Now you have a car.
Right.
And I think it's such a wonderful symbol for that idea of a transition to another level of understanding, in the same way that Horus is the hawk guy, that you get this height.
That birds are the volatile principle, that you have the z-axis available to you, and landlocked things do not. Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Hey, let me show you one more thing. Have you seen the last discovery? I've been working with this pylon thing. I'm going to try and share again. Am I sharing now?
Not yet.
Let's see. Sharing is caring, apparently. Let's see. There we go.
Don't want to have to see myself. If you could share the screen where I'm not on it, that's great.
If there's a way of sharing that doesn't involve me, okay, let's see.
The other interesting thing, too, about the cocoon thing that Jeremy Nather talked about was he said something where there's some point in the cocoon where you can stick a pin in it and not harm the caterpillar because it's liquefied. It's become fluid.
Wow.
Yeah.
Can you see that?
Yeah.
All right, check this out. I'll just play it for you. So this is the classic Egyptian pylon facade. And so in light of the things that you brought up, I took another look at this model, and instead of just indicating like the height and altitude of the brain parts, now that after having gone through all the graphics for your stuff, and I have a much more acute appreciation of the ventricles, the role of the ventricles in all of this. So the pituitary gland is right in the middle. This is interesting that the exact width of the door is framed by the optic tract. Here's the rock star of consciousness, the third ventricle. Here's the pylon, the pineal gland that's exactly in the center of this lower area here. But the thing that killed me the most was that if you find the right coronal cross-section. Oh, so here's the thalamus bits. Here's the entire thalamus. But you see where it's going. So there's the fornix, is the circle in the wings, and then literally the winged disc. So this is a coronal cross-section at the lateral ventricles, where the third ventricle, and there's your winged disc right there, the two wings with the circle in the middle. And they are the exact width of the architecture perfectly describes them. When I first met John, or even before that, I'm sure I told you this, one of the reasons that got me sucked into ancient Egypt was I did a video game where I had to do the graphics for this video game that was set in ancient Egypt. And so I had to find all of these old Mazzini and different blueprints and recreate these temples in 3D. And this thing here, this little bastard here, this thing was a nightmare to model, and I just really got mad at it, and I got resentful of it, and kept thinking, why is this even here? What a bunch of idiots, why would they even put that here? And then after you did your research about the ventricles are exactly that shape that's swept, and you notice up here too, by the way, this thing exactly hits at the major fissures of the brain, and the corpus callosum stretches exactly so the two humps, not only the mounds themselves represent the hemispheres, but this space in between is exactly where the corpus callosum falls. The olfactory glands are literally centered in the two pillars. And then, of course, if you look at the brain from the other view, Gary's remarkable finding with the Eye of Horus correlation.
But you want to know what's even more interesting about that, the wings and the ventricles, that's pretty awesome. Bill Donahue had made this whole point about how the Ark of the Covenant is the brain. And he talks about how there is etymological link between the word cerebrum and cherubim.
Wow.
And the whole point of and not even that they just sound the same. That'd be one of those things where the left-timers, and not just because they're two words that sound the same, but he makes the point that the CERE of cerebrum and the CHER of cherubim share an etymological root of Ker, which means to cover with wax. And I've heard that you can dig into the brain. It's soft enough, like with a spoon, so that I need like a wax sort of like thing. But the interesting thing about that is in the story of the Ark of the Covenant, is that God speaks to man between the wings of the cherubim.
Wow.
And in Michelangelo's painting, that's where Sophia is coming out of the ventricle, right? Or that God's reaching out too. So that's really cool. That I didn't even think. There was another time in 6 where you lay up that graphic, and the ventricles, the way you've got them lit up, it almost looks like a grail. I think did you do that on purpose? There was one point you were talking about the grail, and it looks like a grail. And even that, though, the skull is also considered the grail. I mean, if you think about the chalice, and there's the fluid that's inside, the skull is the grail. The Ark of the Covenant.
But there is a cavity in the body that is exactly grail-shaped. And like you were saying, it's the ventricles. Here's a crazy thing, and I don't know if anybody's talking about this or if everybody's talking about this. You know, David Bowie, the last thing he did before he died is he published that amazing Black Star video. Have you seen Bowie's Black Star?
I saw pieces of it.
Go back and watch it again. There's this thing that he does, and the whole thing is this veiled homage to the third eye. The lyrics are, in the center of it all, in the center of it all, your eye. And in one of the lyrics, he doesn't say eyes, he says, in the center of it all, your eye. And, you know, all that symbolism. So the Holy Grail is hidden in the last place you'd ever expect. It's hidden in the center of it all. Go back and watch Black Star now. I wish I could steal the usage rights for it.
But even that again, to the Aaron's perfect black thing, that a moon is hidden in the pupil. You know, he hides in the pupil. But the other thing too is that idea that you know, the darkness, that you have to go into the darkness to see the light, that you have to go into the cave, and then that idea of closing out the external and going internal. I mean, that's the whole idea of almost like the king's chamber in the pyramid, is that you're in this total darkness, and you're no longer, all external senses have been cut off, and you're forced to go within. That guy that Venice told me about, Christopher Beisch, I think his name is. Have you listened? She sent me some lecture of his.
She's going to do an interview with him in the next week or two. Yeah.
Oh, that's amazing. The one lecture she sent me of his, he described the use of psychedelics to explore consciousness better than any person I've ever heard describe it. And he talks about that idea that when you remove all of the external sensory input, you are confronted with consciousness, and you can't get away from it. Like you come face to face with all of these internal aspects. And that idea of, you know, it can be all this woo-woo hippy dippy shit where like you got to go inside, man, and go within. But really that is going into darkness. You got to get rid of every external input, and you have to go into the darkness that is within the cave. And I think that's why we constantly see this symbolism of caves, of initiation rites taking place in Malta, like in hypogeums, and in the pyramid, and even in all the temples. The idea is that the Holy of Holies is this dark room that it's even their float tanks too. There's your and when we go to bed at night, we do it all too. You lay down in a dark room and you shut off, and you go within the subconscious, and you have these insane experiences in the dreamscape. And it's all because you're in the dark, you know. And I think too often people associate darkness with evil and nefarious, you know. And they talk about, how am I supposed to resolve good and evil? Am I supposed to be somewhat evil and somewhat good? And I don't think that is what they're talking about.
Wednesday, and Fridays.
Right. It's one of my evil days today. You know, you got me on an evil day. Get me tomorrow, I'll be on a good day.
It's really your fault, not mine.
Yeah. But just even that, and again, that idea of like the cocoon, you have to, or even, every night, like Manly Hall says, it's a mini death when you lay down. You lay your body to rest every night.
Le petit mort.
Say again?
Le petit mort, they call it. The little death.
Yeah. I think there's something that our ancestors they go into caves, and they would have internal, introspection. And I think about that idea, like we're talking about, we're with exception when we go to bed at night. I do it, and I know Kristen does it too. Like we'll have our phones sometimes. Like you're not ready to go to bed, so you're still messing with your phone or something like that. And like that ability to go within and to be introspective, I think, was quintessential for what our ancestors were doing and why they were using caves and why they were using dark rooms and why they built massive mountains like the pyramid. And inside it is this tiny little cave. I mean, it's such a brilliant juxtaposition of the mountain and the cave. And in Hindu temples, that's a huge symbolism for that as well. That you have this big, massive structure and this smaller internal structure, and it's when you start to understand, like you said, the metaphor and the symbols, it's no longer just these superstitious people trying to explain a world that they can't understand with crazy stories about gods taking the sun across the sky in a boat, and it's all this brilliant metaphor and this brilliant symbol. And I think the scientific community and the sort of spiritual community both suffer from sort of the same problem, which is literalism. I mean, even like the ancient alien thing is sort of a literal, you're reading these stories as sort of literal stories of beings coming down and descending from the heavens and all of these things. And when you understand these things metaphorically, it all of a sudden those weirdo stories start to take on meaning and understanding in ways you go, oh, of course, that makes so much sense than it being this insane story or some simpleton person trying to figure out why there's thunder, or why, I guess it's the gods bowling or whatever, and then you realize the intelligence and the beauty, like we've been talking about. You realize the how brilliant these artists were, and I mean, I think about that with Egypt, where if you're making hieroglyphs on the wall and you're carving these statues, those artists had to know the meaning of all that symbology. You could maybe hire a stoneworker and say, make me a statue that looks like this, but it seems like artwork had been, as a prerequisite, versed in all of the symbolism and all of the meaning behind it. And it makes human beings that much more fascinating and more interesting than just thinking these were, people, cutting off people's heads on the Mayan pyramids and sacrificing to not that they maybe did, I don't know if they did that or not. It seems like they probably did. I don't know, but you know what I mean, right?
You just reminded me of something. Speaking of the gods bowling, the Yakim and Boaz pillars in masonry. It's the 7-10 split. Little bowling humor for you. The old 7-10 split. All right, anyway, forget about that. So, Brad, thank you very much. This was great. This is supposed to be a 10 or 15-minute talk, and clearly it was more than that, because the irrepressible Brad, you can't fit him into a schedule, and I certainly can't shut up when I'm around you. Folks, Magical Egypt Series 2 is out and available, and there are some paradigm-shifting discoveries that are sure to be confrontational to people in certain industries, but hugely liberating and revolutionary for people like artists and people who want to know more about their own consciousness, and about a time when people understood consciousness and tried their best to present a owner's manual for the human psyche. Brad Clausen, you are a giant among men, and your actual size. Not only are you a giant, but your actual size in the most humble, perfect way. All right, anything else? Any final thoughts?
You and I could, like I said, we could probably talk for 5 hours. So if you want me to have final thoughts, we're going to go be talking for another hour.
All right. Well, then I'm going to exercise my censorship. No.
And I'm kind of jacked on yerba mate, so I've probably been rambling and probably talking like a meth head.
Your pupils are giant. All right, my friend. Well, let's talk soon. I'll contact you after this, and we'll make further plans. I'm glad that you read The Perfect Black. I can't wait to get started on that.
No, it's funny. I have I pay attention to those little hints and things from the universe, for lack of a better term. But like, if somebody says, "Hey, have you read this?" and you're like, you in the email, you're like, "You have it," and I was like, "I do have it," and right away I was like, I have to go read it, because it was almost like, and it was. I still got to read more of it, but it was brilliant. It made me want to sit down with Aaron, just listen to him talk about stuff, because it was so well written and so well researched, and like, he knows so much about esotericism and just history, and it was great. Yeah, I'm really glad that you made me go look at it.
Well, we'll be seeing a lot more of both of you characters in upcoming episodes. If you want to feel like you're in the room with Aaron, have you seen Flight of the Conchords?
Yeah.
Oh my God. It's like my new religion now. I watch it and watch it and watch it and watch it. I love that show. That quintessential New Zealand sense of humor. Anyway, you be good. Enjoy that sweet, sweet pickle money. And I'll talk to you soon.
Okay. Bye.